My name is JJ Spoon, and I'm the director of the European Studies Center at the University of Pittsburgh. On behalf of the European Studies Center and the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, welcome to our International Women's Day Roundtable on the battle over gender equality in Europe. In recent years, the European Union has adopted far-reaching legislation and policies to support women's rights and access across a broad range of issues, from the gender pay gap through accession to the Istanbul Convention on Violence Against Women, to gender equality in culture and foreign affairs, biodiversity, and digital policy. Yet several member states have resisted such transnational efforts and have not only removed the word gender from official documents and eliminated the field of gender studies in higher education, but also rolled back gender rights within their boundaries, which has led to sustained protests, most notably in Poland and Hungary. Today, I'm joined by a panel of experts and practitioners to discuss these topics. I am pleased to introduce our moderator, Dr. Muge Kokten Finkel. Dr. Finkel is the director of the Masters in International Development Program and a faculty member at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs and the co-director of the Gender Inequality Research Lab, GIRL, at the University of Pittsburgh. Her expertise includes gender and development, poverty and inequality, and Japanese politics. Previously, she worked as a social development specialist for the MENA region at the World Bank. Since 2015, she has worked within the United Nations Development Program, or UNDP, to analyze global trends in gender equality in public administration. Welcome, Muge.
Thank you. Thank you, JJ, and thank you to European Studies Center and the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies at the University of Pittsburgh for organizing this very timely roundtable. And a very big thank you to our panelists who are joining us from different parts of the world, as well as from different paths, exemplifying all the incredibly important work women do, from designing and implementing legislation, to keeping that legislation honest and accountable, to enlightening us with scholarship. And of course, a big thank you to and welcome to our audience. We are very excited for this panel. To say that International Women's Day 2021 finds the world in a very perplexed place is an understatement. 110 years after the first gathering to celebrate women's rights and equality, march towards equality, we now have a history of progress that is neither uniform nor linear. As we celebrate milestones of gender equality, we are also frequently reminded that it will take no less than a century, or 99.5 years to be precise on average, for the global gender gap to close. And even the European experience with the highest levels of gender parity is not without its own troubling signs of regress. Sweden, which is ranked at the 4th place out of 154 countries in gender equality, has slipped 1 spot since 2018. Poland stands at number 40, but Hungary is 105th place, having slipped 3 spots since the last time that the gender equality measures were reported. The US, for comparison's sake and for our audience, it stands at a 53rd place, also having slipped 2 spots. This is all to suggest that in terms of progress towards gender equality, none can be taken for granted, and regress is just as likely of an outcome as progress. With this in mind, we now turn to our panelists today to help us understand truly the battle over gender equality in Europe. Our panelists each have received individual sets of questions to bring their expertise to bear on the discussion of European experience with gender equality and to help set the stage. I will briefly introduce them before inviting them to speak, about 10 minutes each. We will then have 2 additional questions that we hope all of our 4 panelists can address, which will be followed by questions from the audience. I ask the audience to please use the Q&A button to share your questions, and we hope to have a good discussion and fruitful march towards gender equality with the help of our panelists today. Without further ado, I have the pleasure of introducing our first panelist. Dr. Malgorzata Fidelis is an associate professor of history at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Her research focuses on social and cultural issues and the relationship between the individual and the state in post-1945 Eastern Europe. Her work has appeared in American Historical Review, Journal of Women's History, Slavic Review, among others. Her first book, Woman, Communism and Industrialization in Post-War Poland is a study of female workers and communist policies in Poland. She's currently completing her second book, tentatively titled Imagining the World from Behind the Iron Curtain, Youth and the Global 60s in Poland. Thank you for joining us, Małgorzata.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for a very kind introduction and for inviting me to this panel. I am a historian and I don't always get invited to panels on current events. So I am really happy to be here. So it is extremely important to situate the current developments regarding gender politics in Europe in a historical perspective, not only to understand the connections between the past and the present, but also to help us interrogate some of the assumptions that we see in the media or some conventional interpretations of what is happening to gender and women in Eastern Europe. Rather than providing some fixed answers, I would like to offer some preliminary and perhaps provocative thoughts and questions on how to think historically about the current attack on gender in Eastern Europe and especially in Poland. And I hope that this introduction generates more questions, and then we have we can have a discussion. So from the dominant media discussions in the West and to some extent in Eastern Europe is often identified as some kind of aberration, as a place where the right-wing authoritarian populism and the assault on democratic values is somehow inherent, at least to the political elites. However, we need to keep in mind that the attack on women, reproductive rights, the attack on the LGBTIQ communities is a global phenomenon. It is happening in many places. It's not unique. In fact, it's happening in the United States as well. Right-wing populist leaders are transnational. They learn from each other. I would also argue that the state's assault on reproductive justice in Poland, in particular, is a relatively new development grounded in the experiences of the post-communist era. So what I would like to suggest is that gender equality and backlash against that equality work in a dialectical way. In Poland and other countries in Eastern Europe, there is a long and contested history of policies aimed at gender equality. The history of gender equality in Eastern Europe does not start with the so-called return to Europe after 1989 or with joining of the EU. There is a long history of the politics of gender equality under communism, however imperfect. And that history includes periodic and intense backlashes against women and the perceived gender transgressions. That history also includes women's protests and acts of resistance against those attacks. So in my book on women workers in Poland, I discussed one such backlash during de-Stalinization, when women who worked in male-dominated, well-paid and prestigious occupations that they had secured during the Stalinist industrial drive were removed from their jobs in the name of Polish tradition. Indeed, often the policies of equality under communism coexisted in disturbing ways with discrimination against women, or even with state violence against women, as was the case, for example, in Romania under Ceausescu. So what we are witnessing now, I think, is that dialectic process at work, and this is especially visible in Poland. We have a powerful government-led assault on gender and reproductive rights on the one hand, but then we also have massive protests from below that this assault generates. And this is part of a longer pattern State-led or state-sanctioned gender equality has a longer history in Eastern Europe than in Western Europe. For a good part of post-war period, we had this ironic situation in which women in Eastern Europe had equal rights to men, but they were living in non-democratic oppressive regimes. At the same time, women in Western democracies were nominally included in the democratic polity, but they did not have equal rights to men for a long time, until the feminist movements of the 1960s and the 1970s. So how do we reconcile these two different experiences? How do we make sense of them moving forward? And one way to think about these issues is to acknowledge that democracy in Europe or anywhere in the world, including the United States, is very young. Democracy that attempts to include women is about 50 years old or so. Ironically, the current ban on abortion in Poland goes against not only the principles of democracy, but also against Polish history and Polish tradition. Historically, Poland has had a relatively liberal abortion law. In 1932, when the first modern Polish penal code was formulated, Poland had the most liberal abortion legislation in all of Europe after the Soviet Union. Stalin banned abortion in the Soviet Union in 1936. So for some time, Poland had one of the most liberal abortion legislations in Europe. And the legislation allowed for abortion if the mother's health was in danger, if the pregnancy was a result of rape, incest, or if the woman was a minor under 15. So the progressive element, although it does not sound progressive today, was this the health of the mother, the idea that you could have an abortion if there is a medical condition involving the mother. In most European countries and the United States at the time, abortion was illegal, with the exception of when the woman's life was in danger. The Penal Code of 1932 also decriminalized homosexuality. Again, this was against the Western European norm at the time. Eventually, abortion was legalized in Poland in 1956, together with most of the East European countries and the Soviet Union during that time. And here is where we need to acknowledge and bring back East European experiences to the history of gender equality and feminism. The dominant perception in Europe, including Eastern Europe, is that gender equality and feminism come from the outside, from the West. Even the dominant feminist narrative in Poland, for example, is that there was no feminism between 1945 and 1989, so prior to the collapse of communism. So there is this narrative about feminism as being foreign, as being imposed from above, that allowed right-wing politicians to capitalize on that narrative. This leads me to the last point I wanted to make, and that is that we need a different, more inclusive narrative of gender politics and gender equality. Distorted historical narratives about feminism as an exclusively Western import fuel to a large extent the backlash against women that developed in many parts of Eastern Europe after the fall of communism and after the European integration, the kind of attacks that we are witnessing now. So this trope that gender is foreign and feminism is something that comes from outside helps right-wing populists fuel anxieties and create new divisions in society. We need a new narrative of what European gender equality means. We need to counter the right-wing discourse with the narrative that is grounded in historical experiences. And this may be the first step to move forward towards a more inclusive and effective gender politics in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Malgorzata. This was a great opening, and you have kindly provided us a great historical framework where we tend to see some of these changes as new, as happening at the moment, to kind of see them in almost like a cyclical pattern, and try to understand what is the historical forces that have driven them to forefront in the first place. So I thank you very much for starting our conversation in a historically grounded way. Our next panelist, Dr. Lenka Bustikova, is an associate professor in the School of Politics and Global Studies in Arizona State University. Her research focuses on party politics, voting behavior, clientelism, and state capacity with specific reference to Eastern Europe. Her book, Extreme Reactions, Radical Right Mobilization in Eastern Europe, demonstrates that far-right parties mobilize against politically ascendant minorities, and has received the Davis Center Book Prize in Political and Social Studies. Lenka is also a recipient of the 2015 Best Article Prize, awarded by the American Political Science Association's European Politics and Society section for her article, Revenge of the Radical Right. She's currently serving as the editor of the East European Politics. Thank you, Lenka, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank JJ for a kind invitation. This is actually the second time I'm participating in the debates at the Center for European Studies, so it's great to be back. It's a tough act to follow after Malgorzata, so I'm going to put more contemporary political hat, but I think some of the points that she raised will resonate in my presentation as well. So let me share my screen. That will help me to walk through some of the points I would like to make. So the issue that we are discussing is extremely complex, and I just want to highlight some aspects that, at least in my own research, I find really important. So in this slide, hopefully you can see it, you see a picture of Oslav Kaczynski and his program Family 500 Plus, Rodzina 500 Plus. This was a social welfare program introduced in 2016 in Poland. It had it's very popular. It gave tax-free payments. It's a child allowance program, and it has multiple purposes. It alleviated poverty, but its goal was also to increase fertility in Poland, which my understanding is so far was not very successful. But thinking about the program 500 Plus brings me to the point that I would like to make, that if we want to think about women's rights, gender rights, LGBT rights in Eastern Europe, and I think elsewhere, we have to think about the intersection of identity politics, party competition, and social welfare policies and challenges in social welfare provision that East Europe is facing. So, similar issue that is raised to the issue of fertility and birth rates in Eastern Europe was raised in 2019 by Viktor Orban. It sort of shows you the interplay of migration allowances and children. So Hungary also introduced a very generous welfare program for wealthy men, middle class, upper middle class women. And in 2019, he said, in all of Europe, there are fewer and fewer children, and the answer of the West to this is migration. We Hungarians have a different way of thinking. We want Hungarian children. Migration for us is surrender. So in the remarks that I will, I'm building on my book published in 2019, but also on a working paper with Petra Gwasty from Charles University in the Czech Republic, which is called at this moment Macho Martyrs and Their Maidens, a liberal backlash against universal rights in Central Europe. So why do we see a backlash? So one thing I just would like to stress is that I don't think about the Law and Justice Party and Fidesz in Hungary as radical right parties or far right parties. I think of them as radicalized mainstream parties because they started as very mainstream, conservative, quite reasonable parties, and over time they moved to the extreme. These are not niche parties; these are parties that have complex, economic, social wealth programs, and also they are ruling parties, and therefore they can roll back legislation and implement policies. I think the big thing that's happening in Eastern Europe and perhaps elsewhere is a big push to come back to something, this mystical unicorn that's called traditional family. And that can explain why there is a pushback against abortion in some states, why there is a pushback for traditional or so-called traditional gender roles, and a huge pushback against the LGBTQ advancement. And why are these things happening? I think there are three possible explanations. One, in my book, I think a lot about backlash against policy shifts. So I think since 1989, and Małgorzata already talked about this, there has been a big change in the status quo. There has been a lot of minority accommodation, big expansion of minority rights. The LGBTQ community is the last one to really start, fighting for their rights, and this generates a backlash. When we think about the rulings of the European Court of Human Rights, European Court of Justice on discrimination, these rulings break into the national legislatures of the members of the European Union and signal, it's a pretty strong signal that in the long run, some of the discrimination practices are unsustainable. And this, according to populist rules, violates sovereignty. I think, and I would like to highlight, this is not an excuse for some of these policies, is that there are big structural issues in Eastern Europe that I think are not appreciated, at least in political science, which is demography and outmigration. If you look at demography, Eastern Europe is one of the fastest shrinking regions in the world. The fertility rates, are low, and there's also a lot of outmigration because, of course, a lot of people migrate to the West because of the European expansion. And what happens after this, combination of no babies and people are gone? So there are labor shortages in Eastern Europe. It's a big problem. It also has a big impact because all the Czech nurses are working in Germany and Austria. It's a big issue of healthcare and welfare protection for the elderly. When you suddenly have shortages of doctors, shortages of nurses, all the elderly care workers again are migrating to the West. And then, to compensate for, there's actually an inflow of, other migration. But this is really destabilizing some of the social contract that has been present there before. And finally, ideas are very important. I think, and certainly this is the case also in the United States, that we are seeing a surge of socially conservative civil society or uncivil society that is aligning with political parties, and they are pushing forward socially conservative agendas. So just to highlight how bad the demographic crisis is, this is population growth in the V4 countries, Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovakia, Poland. The curves, are going down, and so the red estimate is estimate with migration. So there's actually, despite the the rhetoric, there's actually a lot of in-migration coming in from Ukraine and actually from China, from other parts of the world into these countries because of, as I mentioned, massive labor shortages and shortages of nurses and other essential workers. So I don't want to sort of repeat what Małgorzata said, but when I think about the legislation, a lot that is happening has to do with abortion legislature and constitutional amendments, which actually failed in some countries that want to basically embed so-called traditional marriage in the constitution. And of course, there's a lot of contestation against issues of child adoption for the LGBT community. One thing I'm sure there is going to be a big debate about it. I would like to highlight just a few things about the Polish situation. The 1993 abortion law in Poland was already extremely restrictive. Poland is actually a big outlier in this sense. And the 2020 amendment, which generated so much backlash in Poland, actually was done via the Constitutional Court. So the party didn't have the guts to run this through the parliament, and they're trying to, find some ways. And actually, when you think about it from like Russian perspective as a, simplistic political scientist, the law does not make a lot of sense because the Law and Justice Party in a way shot itself in the leg and was aware that, these efforts in 2016 generated massive counter mobilization. So why did this happen? So there are a couple of political science suggestions. One is that the Law and Justice Party is politically outbidding with a more far-right party Confederation, so they had to go harder. There are also big debates about factionalism within party and promises made to the Catholic Church. The law generated a massive counter-mobilization, which is different from the mobilization against the rule of law issues. So now what you see is that more young people are protesting, and also people from middle and small localities, which again, from the perspective of Law and Justice Party, is completely stupid because this is their voter base. The Hungarian case, the most significant sort of change is an amendment, 2012 amendment, so-called gay ban, by a now infamous member of the European Parliament, but also the constitution is now has protection of licensed conception and sex issues to solidify your sex orientation at birth, which is a jab at the transgender community. However, when we think comparatively about abortion in V4 countries, in general, abortion, with the exception of Poland, is widely available, widely popular. And actually, in general, the status quo in abortion is quite popular. And that includes Poland when the public support thinks that the 1993 law was okay. And so, as I said, the 1993 was very restrictive. But in all these 3 other countries, until the 12th week of the fetus, you can get abortion on request. And actually, one of the reasons why this is a very tricky issue for Orban is that Hungary has one of the highest rates of abortions. And so an abortion on demand, so-called abortion on demand, is highly popular. So from a voting perspective, this is a kind of worms to step into. So they are trying to fight abortion through through the back door by incentivizing doctors not to perform it, but really to go and fully said, like, we are implementing a full ban and running it through the parliament. This is politically very difficult. I just also want to say that the numbers of abortions, official abortions in Poland, are very low, but I'm from the Czech Republic, and a lot of these abortions are performed abroad, and the Czech clinics do it quite often. So what's the end game and who's protesting? So as I mentioned, in Poland, there is a big shift, there is a big expansion of the counter-mobilization against the current Law and Justice Party, when the protesters are from all over the place. In general, and this is a gross simplification, these protesters, follow the urban cosmopolitan cleavage versus, traditional cleavage. But on the one hand, Hungary has a lock-in because of the electoral system. Its power is locked in. But most of the populist parties in Eastern Europe really have a ceiling, and they have to be careful about some of these policies because it generates a lot of backlash. And in Poland, really, this can undermine the Law and Justice Party because it's so unpopular. What's the end game? I just, for the voters, I would like to highlight that there are different types of policies and grievances. So abortion bans are very unpopular because they, every woman, this affects every woman or their daughters. And then, but once we sort of move to the domain of gender equality, pay, and LGBTQ issues, there, I think, the LGBTQ issues is a niche party. And I think it's fair to say that most voters in Eastern Europe don't care about gender departments being shut down. This is, I think, a niche issue, as opposed to issues such as an abortion ban. So it's, I think it's important to think about it as on a scale. I would like to highlight the fact that in all V4 countries, we see a new extremely popular policy package offered by populists, which combines targeted welfare policies, increased child allowances. We see it in Slovakia, Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland. There are nuances. These welfare programs for families and child allowances are extremely popular. And so there is a combination of nationalism or identity politics with targeted welfare spending, which at least before the pandemic really resonated very well with the voters. A lot of people really care about their pocketbooks in this respect. What's the end game for parties? I think, there is some, at least rhetorically, and we see it in all countries, there is an effort to boost fertility, to put women back into traditional roles. And I think if you think about what, let's say the sudden welfare systems do for women, is that if women embrace more traditional roles, you can use them, so to speak, to support weak healthcare systems and elderly care. So, the healthcare issue is a very salient issue in Eastern Europe. I mean, the pandemic is sort of exposing its weakness. So very often you really need, the doctors will do the surgery, but you need a family member to really supplement the care and to be there and help out. And the same goes for the elderly care. And women, women who are in traditional roles are more likely probably to offer parallel services that the state is not capable of providing. Obviously, this is about a power grab as well. And finally, I would like to highlight that there are, and this will bring us to debates also, that there is a new alliance. In 1989, the civil society that fought against communism was anti-political. So they did not align with political parties. Today, the socially conservative civil society absolutely uses political parties to pursue their agendas, and the parties, reciprocate the love. And this is a new, I think, a global alliance and a huge political force to be reckoned with. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lenka. This is fantastic, and you have opened up some of the issues when we talk about gender equality, that it is never limited to issues that only matter for women. And you're highlighting some of the points that we hope to get back in when we have the floor for the open discussion in terms of intersectionality, how attitudes, political attitudes towards women's right actually help may concede attitudes towards gender identity, LGBTQI rights, as well as migration. So this is a really important point about gender being just more than issues of that only interest women and men. So thank you very much for that, and we hope to kind of get back to it during discussion. Our next expert is joining us today from Brussels. Elise Banku is a member of the European Parliament for the Swedish Green Party and serves as a member of the Committee for Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs. She is also the coordinator for the Green EFA political group in the Committee for Women's Rights and Gender Equality. MEP Kunke works with the questions relating to women's rights, LGBTQI, migration, democracy, rule of law, and climate justice. She's a former minister in the Swedish government responsible for culture and democracy, and previously worked as Director General for the Swedish Agency for Youth and Civil Society, General Secretary for Fair Trade Sweden, and Sustainability Director at the company AFE. MEP Kunke, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored, and I'm so glad to be part of this discussion, and I'm looking forward to asking questions to all who have already spoken. As said, my name is Alice Kunke, and I am MEP. I was elected soon 2 years ago, and it's a 5-year mandate, and I represent the Green Party in Sweden. And the fact that we still have to arrange seminars on this topic is very frustrating, not only for me, I suppose for all of us. It is astonishing that we still have to debate and defend basic human rights. As we heard from the previous speakers, as late as a few weeks ago, women and girls in Poland more or less lost the right to decide over their own bodies. And the ongoing backlash against women's rights is evident, and it is our obligation to fight it. One could feel frustration and hopelessness when considering the situation we find ourselves in. It is important that we not only focus on the fight against the destructive forces, against the Hungarian Prime Minister Orban's misogynist regime, against the Polish government's inhuman treatment of women, girls, rainbow families, single mothers, and LGBTI people, but that we also continue to fight for progressive change. We need to keep on providing visions and examples of an alternative path and show that people like us fighting for freedom and equality represent the majority. So today I will talk about what role the European Parliament and me as a parliamentarian should play in pushing regressive member states to take all their citizens' fundamental rights into account. and what are the tools we can use in order to provide as much resistance as possible against this backlash. The Parliament has limited competencies in the area of women's rights and gender equality, as the majority of the work is handled at member state level. This is unfortunate, as some governments do not consider the rights of their citizens a priority. However, as you know, the principle of equality is enshrined in the treaty. It is one of the European Union's core values. And this is worth mentioning and repeating time after time. And in line with the treaties, we are obliged to mainstream all activities to eliminate inequalities and promote equality. And one efficient way to influence member states and push them to respect fundamental rights is to make sure that all spendings and investments reflect our priorities and our values as defined in our treaties. A member state that does not respect the rule of law, our common values, and our democratic principles as defined by the treaties should not receive EU funding. It is just as simple as that. Unfortunately, not all politicians agree with me. From a parliament's perspective, we have to make sure that gender equality is pushed in every action, every meeting, and every piece of legislation that we put forward. As a hands-on politician, empty words are not enough. We have to stay alert in all legislative procedures. And we should apply a bottom-up approach on these issues, even though the rights of the citizens is not a priority to some member states, their voters are. So we need to talk more about the fact that citizens vote for these oppressive governments. The Parliament should therefore not only strive to put pressure directly towards governments, but also indirectly to influence public opinion in these countries by providing funding to civil society actors aiming at strengthening women's rights, sexual and reproductive rights, and anti-discrimination. Just as the destructive movements around the EU are building strong alliances, European cooperation allows for progressive movements to do so as well. And this was manifested during the women's suffrage movement in the 20th century. And a more current example is the sexual consent law that was introduced in Sweden a few years ago, which has inspired neighboring countries in the same direction. And there are several examples. And the European Parliament, as the spider web of national representation, is in a unique position that enables us to provide platforms for transnational civil society cooperation. And I cannot underline this enough. We need to use all the tools that we have to strengthen the progressive movements and organizations, especially those working within the countries where gender equality is most fragile. And this is why the EU's Rights and Values Programme, a small program within the 7-year budget, the MFF, is so important for us Greens. In November, I negotiated this program on behalf of the Parliament and managed to secure 1.55 billion euros to civil society actors across Europe. And this financial support will surely help to better combat regressive forces while strengthening our democracies, LGBTI people's rights, equality, the fight against gender-based violence, and the rule of law. However, as human rights have already been stripped, we need to counter the tremendous suffering happening as we speak. Women and girls in Poland must be able to access safe and legal abortions in other EU countries. Poland did this for Swedish women back in the 60s, and now we have to show the same solidarity towards them. We also need to support the LGBTQI movement across Europe. An ongoing effort in the Parliament is to declare the EU an LGBTQI freedom zone. We will do so this week. With this statement, we will send a strong message that we support all people and will fight to protect their right to live and love as they please. This also highlights the fact that the EU is not only its institutions, the Commission, the Council, and the Parliament, it is a community of citizens. And here, Erasmus is a very important institution as it enables the young adults and future leaders of the EU to exchange cultures, languages, and knowledge. And it enables future generations to live in greater diversity during their formative years. I do believe this, in a long-term perspective, is a very important factor to promote all forms of equality, gender equality included. To conclude, the Parliament does lack sufficient tools to push governments to respect women's rights, but it remains a fact that all member states under the treaties are obliged to respect, guarantee, protect, and fulfill fundamental rights and the rights of women. For a long time, there has not been much ambition from the Commission's side to stand up for these rights as the guardian of the treaties, but as gender equality is a priority for President Ursula von der Leyen, I hope things will change. With stronger commitments from the Commission, me and my colleagues in the European Parliament have a better position towards the Council when negotiating important pieces of legislation to counter the ongoing backlash against equality and women's rights. Thank you for having me here today.
Thank you, MEP Kuhnke. We really appreciate your thoughts, and especially so allowing us to see that as the late Supreme Court Justice in the US, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, has said, you know, it's my personal motto is the women belong to all places decisions are made. So you're allowing us to see why that truly matters. And hopefully we are moving not only on that side of the ocean, but also on this part, and more so globally. You know, to the point that the Commission on the Status of Women meetings at the UN that are going to be convened starting next week. I find personally and professionally solace in the fact that they have chosen the theme of women's place in public, so that we can redefine public as you and our previous speakers have mentioned, including civil society, looking at women in all decision-making positions, not limited to elected office, but as well as, you know, public administration, civil society, and see, as you mentioned, as a community for gender equality. Thank you very much, and we hope that this will be the beginning of the conversation as we go through our panel. Last but not least, we are grateful and thankful to Laura Albu, our final panelist today. Laura is the Vice President of the European Women's Lobby. She has been a member of the Executive Committee of the European Women's Lobby since 2014, representing the Romanian Women's Lobby. In Romania, she has been the CEO of Community Safety and Mediation Center since 2000, where she has coordinated over 25 programs related to social services for domestic violence, child abuse, and vulnerable victims. For over 15 years, Laura has worked to promote new legislation in the field of violence against women in Romania and conflict resolution. She is one of the founders of the Romanian Women's Lobby and has been its president since 2015. She also represents the European Women's Lobby in the Expert Forum of the European Institute for Gender Equality, IEG. Laura, we look forward to your thoughts. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me, and I'm very happy to follow the great and interesting presentations given by previous speakers, and I will try not to repeat some of the issues in which also Malgorzata and Lenka have entered regarding Eastern European history and background. But I will try to respond to your first question regarding first Romania, where I'm from, regarding how is gender equality different these days since after the fall of the communists and entering of the Romania in European Union. Well, in a way, everything is in the same situation like it was in all the Eastern European bloc, because as you know, women's rights movement was kind of weak in this part of Europe. And so also civil society organizations are not, at least the one working on women's rights, were very poorly funded. And so they have to work on a volunteer base, trying in a way to balance the efforts of having this equilibrium regarding keeping gender equality on the public agenda, while, as Malgorzata or Lenka said, there were never a very deep concern of the public regarding gender equality, because the issues of gender equality were not always linked with the improvement of women's life on a daily basis. And so, in a way, Romania was a little bit fortunate, because not that it has less populist parties than the other countries have, but in a way it was that we have a very um, uh, regarding sexual and reproductive rights, for example, in Romania, because during Ceausescu, as Malgorzata also mentioned, it was a very powerful policy against abortion. And so actually all women after communist time have a very strong stand for protecting these rights. And nevertheless, what we saw in the last years as attacks in Romania have not started in 2020, as everyone saw in a little bit regarding the ban on sex education, and also the other one regarding using the gender terms in university and high school. So both, there were not coordinated attacks, but it was actually launched at 1 month difference, one of the other, in Romania in 2020. But previously to that, we have a initiative regarding redefining the family concept, because in a way, Romania constitution has this definition that the family is actually a reunion between two people, but they were not defined as a woman and a man. So it was like a starting of redefining this, and we have a referendum which failed in terms of, that was the first time when actually civil society organizations have a very, very strong point and also a very good strategy. But going back to the fact that that referendum failed, and also the two proposals in 2020 regarding these attacks on it was a minimum provision of sex education in schools, in which they tried to change into health education and didn't succeed because Constitutional Court rejected that. And the second one regarding banning the terms of gender. All these initiatives, including the redefining the family, it was a common trend with all the other trends in the Eastern European bloc by religious groups, which were not traditional religion in the countries, but some kind of movement who appealed to all the, I don't have the time to enter right now in this. It will be a very interesting discussion. But actually, those initiatives failed, and they are also coordinated with very, very strong attacks against Istanbul Convention, which we are lucky in Romania because Romania ratified it in 2016, and after that have a very progressive legislation in place. But unfortunately for the other countries, that was a battle which is still ongoing to try either to ratify the convention or to keep it in the country, like is the case for Poland. But in a way, we'll move from Romania because I have the other two questions in place regarding most widely what is the situation, how European Women's Lobby addresses the situation in these countries and the policies which European Women's Lobby is proposing. Most of them are looking to the specific needs of civil society, women civil society organizations in these countries through the solidarities lens and also through common information and reaction in terms of advocacy. Actually, we have a group which is a kind of strange for an external eye. It's called CEIBS Task Force, which is Central Eastern European, Balkan and Baltic States group, which addresses actually the issues of women organization in all this territory. And also we have observatory and European Observatory on Violence Against Women at European Women's Lobby level, which also closely monitoring the situation in all the countries. And so they are experts in all this country reporting. And which, for example, helped us during COVID-19 because we were very lucky to collect very rapidly information on what is not going well in terms of access to services during COVID pandemic in different countries. And also European Women's Lobby launched a publication in April last year, which is focusing on the toll COVID-19 is taken from women in all the places and all the fields. And that leads us to the maybe last questions. I'm so sorry we have so little time on focusing, which is what are the main policies we are trying to promote? And that's ideally is the most important one is the Purple Pact, which we launched also last year, and it's focusing on feminist economy, and which is also focusing on how we use gender budgeting and also to solve all these issues. But not only that, it's redefining the way care, which was very obvious during COVID pandemic, has to be seen by the countries, and how if we are focusing on not seeing care as an expense, but in investments on infrastructure, this could lead to much more balanced lives and a much more the increase of the well-being. And I'm very happy Ms. MP Alice Kunke have in a way addressed that issue, because this is also linked with politics. This is only linked with the campaign half of it, which we also support, because is always resources are linked with how our politics are designed and how women are representing to the table of resources. Because all the policies right now, including allocation of funds in the multi-annual framework and all the allocation of funds at the national level, local level, are strictly related to how our politicians are, how our parties are designed, how masculine is this field, and how are we changing this and bringing more women to the table and changing electoral law in our countries in order to have more women debating this. But this is just the the things I would like to discuss. I know we have such, but we are very happy to enter deeply, much more deep into each of these fields, and I'm looking forward to the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. This is a wonderful kind of circling back with the important roles that the lobbying power, right, the watchful eye that the European Women's Lobby provides in terms of keeping an eye on what's happening, not only on laws and legislation, but also whether the monies and the funding that is distributed is actually proceeding in the ways that we hope to kind of lead to change. So thank you very much to our panelists, but I would be amiss if I don't just like start by thanking my colleagues at the University of Pittsburgh for finding such wonderfully well-rounded group of experts that we get to see, that not only starting with Malgorzata, that the assault and what we see as an assault on gender equality that seems to be happening is nothing new. There's a historical precedent to what we are seeing, as well as the public protest against this assault, right? And then with Lenka, we are able to see that how does this fit into politics? Where is the political support? And this is happening. So some of the questions that I'm already seeing in our Q&A are going to come to our experts from that end. And MEP Kunke, you have kind of elaborated the power of the European Union, both as an institution of ideas and institutional model of behavior, but also one that holds the purse string. So when it comes to kind of making sure that the laws and legislations and the member countries are able to come true with what they promise to the ideals of this particular union. So I think all of you very, very much, you have accomplished an impossible task. We've each asked you to summarize your life's work in 10 minutes, and you have given us a wonderful way that we can hope that the next 30 minutes we can explore further. I have two questions that I was hoping that we could all, take quick turns to answer, or whoever wants to answer, and then we will go to our audience who are patiently asking and waiting their turn to kind of speak to you. The very first question is what we're seeing in Poland and Hungary specifically, and more generally in Eastern Europe. Is it part of a larger global movement, or is it specific to place and the histories that you have alluded to? And I think this comes at the back of the concern in the US. A selfish concern is how worried, how concerned should we be here in the US that these events that are happening, the regressions happening at the gender equality, is more global. So I'll start with that. Whoever would like to jump into answering, you're most welcome.
Yeah, I will just say briefly, in my work with Petra Kvasti, there is a direct evidence that evangelical Christian conservative groups have been supporting, civil groups that advocated for the constitutional ban on gay marriage. There is a, follow the money. And of course, there is a very unique alliance with some Russia supported groups, because, on socially conservative issues, and that, again, so to speak, traditionally of family, there is the views are very similar. So I do think there is a global fight for hearts and minds on this issue.
And I can continue. I think that all citizens in all countries should be concerned, not only in the US, but all over the world, because what we also can see now from researchers is that they are organized, and mapping are ongoing to see where the money, as said, comes from. And they are participating at the same conventions and seminars. So yes, we need to be concerned. And sometimes as a progressive politician, you are being blamed for like shouting for the wolf. I don't know if that's a saying. In Sweden, we say that, shout for the wolf. you are comparing Sweden, for example, to Poland and Hungary. It will never happen here. It will never happen. Then all the news comes that we can see that they are the same people at the same seminars, and there are same money going to all these different to fight women's freedom, to fight LGBTQI communities, to fight abortion rights, to fight immigrants, and so on and so forth. So yes, you should be concerned. All of us should.
If I could jump in, so I strongly believe that there is a international, transnational conservative effort that is very much related to what is happening in Eastern Europe. And I think that it's dangerous to overlook this and to say that this is a specifically Polish or Hungarian or something limited to that area, because that it takes attention away from other places in which the same things could happen. So
exactly.
It's a global movement, and I mean there is evidence for this in Poland. The organization that was pushing for this abortion ban, Ordo Juris, is a Brazilian organization. There is a new book that is, I think, coming out this or next month by two Polish scholars, Agnieszka Graf and Elżbieta Korolczuk, who are writing about the flow of international finances and kind of exchanges and conservative groups that are putting in resources, money, and people into these conservative movements. So this is for sure a global movement with, of course, with local specificities, but not limited to any particular locality.
Maybe if I can add something to this, is also regarding the lack of resources women's rights organizations are facing, and also the way the campaigning is done at the women's rights organizations. We discussed that populist movement have a very direct communication, slogans, very easy to understand by the people. And sometimes women's rights organizations are too sophisticated, too technical in communicating what they want, and also don't have resources. Because when we saw the attacks on Istanbul Convention, it was a site which was translated in several languages, and all the languages in the national languages have very clear manipulative form of transmitting information. While when we try, we just make links to all kinds of publications and theories and things like that, and people don't get that. And so we as women's rights organization need to rethink our communications campaign, work together strongly, and also we need more resources to do that. That's kind of.
And I just want to add, if I may, to what the last thing you said about to work together. I think we are so bad in organizing ourselves compared to the right-wing nationalist, anti-gender groups of hate. I mean, we must be as good as them to organize. And where do they find all the billions that they have? We must find money too to protect our democracy and to protect human rights. I get so frustrated when I see how much money they have.
We don't know to sell our needs and do not how to present our case. And we need to work on that. We always say this.
In my presentation, I was trying to underline the power of narratives. And I think that this is very important, to have a narrative that connects with everyday life and with diverse groups of people and different groups of women.
Yes.
And I think also what Alice presented earlier, that maybe we should focus more on inspiring people, on good stories and the study cases of things which are working, because women on the ground are looking for solutions. And sometimes all they see around them is just negative criticism. And so they are in a way disappointed at the fact that nobody's are offering like things they can do, because women are proactive and try to solve things in the community, but sometimes they don't know where to pick this, which are easy to take solutions. So maybe our narrative could be not opposed, not trying to fight back with the same campaign negative tools and criticism and throwing eggs and tomatoes in the people who are talking around us, but maybe coming with positive solutions and things which are working and efficient, cheap solutions we can adapt in our communities, because I don't see anytime soon our work in the ground being supported. So we need to survive and we need to be strong with the lack of resources we have right now. So yeah, it will be tough, but we'll do as we always do, I think.
Yes. And I think it will be very tough. I was, during the negotiations that I talked short about, it was just before Christmas, I was with, it was Germany then, that was the chair of the council. So it was a German man, and it was a commissioner, Commissioner Reinders, and me sitting in a virtual room negotiating. And, you know, even though I put all the facts on the table about the figures, what we need when it comes to what is happening in Europe when it comes to gender-based violence and all, you know, all the bad consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I said, we need to earmark money so that money goes to, I mean, different tasks that we need to solve. And they were like, no, no, no. I mean, the unwillingness to even listen to facts, the unwillingness. So when I talked about the treaties and I said, but it stands here in the treaties, this is what we shall do. We need to protect people. We need to fight for human rights. We need to make sure that we have gender equality. So, and then we need this money and we need to earmark them, because the Commission and the Council, especially the Council, want to have all the money from the MFF to then use them as they want. But we, who are more progressive in the Parliament, we of course want to have them earmarked. But so we really, thanks to that, I won over the German, the Council, because the Commission didn't want it. So I mean, the people not wanting this progressive change, they are everywhere and they have power.
I think you're all bringing a fantastic point right back home, that it is, even though we all kind of are happily publicly declaring and borrowing MEP Kunka's point, that shouting from the rooftops that gender equality is a human right, when it comes to really following it with real actions that include whether it is the budgets and programs and policies, we tend to kind of fall short. And I think that COVID pandemic has demonstrated, right, all the work that has gone to kind of addressing and combating domestic violence have increased, but that has taken a back step. We're almost living in this universe of treating gender equality. It is as good when everything else is good. It's a principle that to be valued, but when things go in a crisis mode, it's a luxury that can be sacrificed. I think that's an important point as we go get ourselves out of this pandemic mode, hopefully sometime soon. There is one more question that before I open up, I go back to our chat, is to kind of going back to what Lenka has already started us thinking about, like we know that gender is more than men and women. Can the gender equality policies, what are the connections between gender rights and gender equality and other rights, right? We want to get to the intersectionalities. Of course, I'm kind of cutting my points down. I just said gender equality even can be a luxury at times, and I'm not now asking you to help us make a case that gender equality does in fact matter for other types of equalities that matter for diversity and inclusion, the values and principles that we all value. So your thoughts?
Well, if I may start shortly. Actually, what we see in all the countries is the fact that most of them politics are very are seen and proposed. The policies are proposed by men, and the policies are supporting the kind of issues they understand, and that is going back to what happened in the room with negotiation, because men in the room can't understand issues they are never facing because there are some women around who are solving those issues. So when we're talking about care, obviously, if you talk about care economy, and we talk about the fact that about unpaid work of women, mostly taken, which it was always unpaid, but during COVID it was even more. So this kind of issues, when we try to win this man over to support our policies and going to many layers, we have to deal from the perspective of age. So talking about women and men who are in care homes at a certain age and how they are affected differently, we need to talk about women and men taking care of their children and how this affects them differently. How many men have left their jobs during COVID to stay home during the school hours with the children? Not many. How many men have lost their jobs in the entertainment industry and restaurants? So we need to going down to the level of understanding of the facts on the everyday lives, and maybe they have people around them who have suffered and lost, and connect on that basic level with them. Otherwise, I think we are talking here, and so unfortunately they are there. So we will never be able to communicate. So unfortunately, when they hear the word gender, they literally lock, and they don't want to talk anymore. So we need to translate this concept to them in particular problem and issues which affect us on a daily basis, and not necessarily use that term, but also to show them how this lack of resources affect differently women and men, girls and boys, because abortions are, performed by girls. Girls are teenagers who have children in our countries, and also girls are the one trafficked. And so talking about how this kind of issues are affecting us at the community level maybe would be an easier way to communicate. Even if we talk about gender equality, there are a lot of people in Eastern Europe, at least, who say, well, we succeed, we are equal since the communism, because, all the legislation in our country said that women and men are equal and we have to be paid equally and all these kind of things. And they literally don't see the inequalities because they can't understand how they are affecting us. So that's at least.
Well, I think when it comes to intersectionality, I think that we will never reach gender equality if we don't have an intersectional approach, because then we risk to have only gender equality for women who are already in a position where they can gain from the equality. So we need to know and to see and to understand, and this is not brain surgery, that the migrant women, the women with disabilities, the Black women, the LGBTQI women, and so on and so forth. I mean, for me, that is, there is no other way. No, we will never reach equality if we don't have an intersectional approach.
Thank you for taking that. Lenka?
Yeah, this is a great question. Maybe, hopefully, there might be some silver lining in COVID, and it will force us to rethink social welfare protection and, the ways, women, take care of. I mean, obviously, men do too, but it is, I think, absolutely obvious now what happened during the pandemic in terms of violence and helping kids with this goddamn online education or what the hell was going on. And so maybe there will be an opening for people to step back and think about who does what, how essential these roles are, and also to think about the crumbling, sort of insufficient healthcare systems, and rethink the role of people who care for other people in our society and how we compensate them. I think at a very very simplistic level, for example, recently I read a study about female doctors in the Czech Republic, which, obviously there is a huge outwave to the West, and they, but their salaries have been raised, and one of the issues that came out was that they are facing an extremely hostile environment among their colleagues. It's something that I thought the political science environment was hostile, but boy, this was really something. And so, at some level, if you if you have a hostile environment, you're going to lose talent, and you're going to use hardworking people. And one final point I want to make is that, unfortunately, the COVID also exposed that, there is a zero-sum game played between the West and the East. It's obvious that, the inflow of care workers goes from the East to the West. The West greatly benefits from this. And of course, nobody can, you cannot stop people from moving. This is one of the European rights, but I think there has to be an acknowledgement that the nursing homes in Western Europe and the hospitals and the care systems depend on a continuing flow from East to the West. And that's a sort of a new level of inequality that we should, worry about as well. And that affects women quite a bit.
So if I may add on the question of intersectionality, I completely agree with Alice that there is no gender equality is not a separate issue. It's so related to the question of human rights and equality. And I also would like to say that this should not be a partisan issue. This should not be that, only the leftist parties are promoting. Human rights are human rights. They are part of humanity. So if we want to have democracy, we need human rights to be part of the democratic agenda in general, not just the leftist parties.
I think this is a great segue. Thank you, Margareta. It's like the first question that we have is whether you see the popular backlash to these right-wing policies and politics that we kind of observe in Poland and Hungary. The question asks if you see a potential for those popular backlashes, resistance, to turn themselves into political moments, credible political moments.
I don't know if I got the question right, but I think was the question if we see that they will form political parties, the resistance towards the populists.
Right.
Yes, because yes,
see them as like coming as a counterbalance and balancing the right wing assault on gender equality.
Well, we are trying to support them to do so. And we can see now in Hungary, for example, we are in very intense discussions from the Green Party with Greens in Hungary to form this coalition that will challenge Viktor Orban and the Fidesz party. So yes, and this is hard because there are parties that we not usually in Hungary are very close to, but we have the same enemy, and the enemy is anti-democratic, populistic, and fascistic. Yes.
I think what is happening around Eastern European countries in the last years is that we see the fact that this young generation raising up, which were never involved in the political scene, have never been members in the political parties, and who are protesting right now against corruption, against injustice, supporting good causes, green economy, green planet. I think this they already started forming like new kind of parties. We have these parties who won elections and enter into the parliament recently in Romania, for example, or have names like Save Romania Union or Plus or things like that. And they are involving a lot of young women and men from which are no longer accepting the kind of status quo. So I think there is some hope in all because these new generations are great, many of them. Also, there is a danger some of the youngest groups to feel attracted by the much more left or right wings extremists. That's true as well. So probably the more we will try to inform these new movements about women perspective. So gender mainstreaming, the young political parties, which are quite entering in the European Parliament as well. I think we have this new group, which after European elections, it's called, how it's called, I haven't a lapsus. Renew Europe. This is a new group of politicians, young politicians. Many of them have never been before, even into a political party. But not many of them have these informations and this culture. So maybe some of them are still misogynistic in their views. So our perspective is to support all these new groups who have very good intentions, and also supporting them in terms of information and making common campaigns in order that we support each other in this common goal.
Thank you, Lara.
So I know that in Poland, many people are holding their breath, waiting for the Law and Justice Party to be toppled. And I'm not sure this is the most helpful way of thinking about women's protests and other movements that are going on against populist authoritarianism. I do believe that women's protests have tremendous political potential, and they are deeply political. They have already changed mentality, culture, which are critical to political change. But we may need to wait for long-term political results, electoral results. And it's also important, it's not only, who is in power, but how politics changes in general. So for example, I was glad to see that the main opposition party in Poland, just the party that used to be in power for 7 or 8 years, more actually, from 2000, 8 years, they were pro-democratic, but they did not support reproductive rights. So I was glad to see that only now, after these protests, they came forward saying that they actually support the women's right to choose, the right to abortion in the first trimester, which is a major departure from the standpoint of most of the pro-democratic parties in Poland. So I think that the most important result is the long-term change, and also the new political subjectivity of women. What we see in Poland is really amazing, and I think revolutionary in terms of the participation of women in these political actions from below. And it's not only elite women, but women from small towns and villages, and the mass participation of young people. So these are hopeful signs to me for some meaningful political change, not just changing parties and changing the men in power.
Algereta, that sounds like music to my ears. As my birthplace, Turkey, I have been very patiently waiting for 20-some years for some change to come along. But I will take your optimism on this particular day. Lenka, and then I'm going to try, I know we're coming very close to our end of our discussion, but I'm going to try to sneak in one more question after Lenka's comments.
Yeah, I'm very pessimistic, just to balance the optimism, I guess. So the world is in balance. I think in order to beat someone like Orban or Kaczynski, it's not going to be done by a small progressive movement. It's going to be done either by some in the establishment party where the vote will be against, not for. And I think the progressive movement can play a role, but it's electorally, it's going to be small, and we should accept that, and that's okay. And it has to find allies, you know, and these allies will be the vehicle of change, but on itself, yeah, it's a tough fight.
Thank you. So our second and unfortunately last question coming from the Q&A is about the role that European Union and European Parliament can actually realistically play. I think it is much appreciated that MEP Kunke's point that the informal fight against the gender backlash through funding of the civil society organization. And the question asks, what is to prevent certain member states to take their cues from Russia, which passed the undesirable organizations laws that bans NGOs and government deems threat to constitutional order and the security of the nation? Could there be an effort to prevent such external NGO funding to counteract attack on gender equality efforts?
Well, as I understand the question, of course, Viktor Orban doesn't like that NGOs in Hungary can receive money to organize themselves and to be stronger, who have other views than he have. But Hungary is, like Sweden, part of the European Union. So we still have tools. We can make exchanges. And this is our role to give support, financial support, but also other ways of support by organizing travels and exchanges. And we have the Erasmus, as I talked about, a whole system of young people to meet each other from other cultures. So of course, there can be new laws in Hungary trying to stop this, and in other countries, but this is the tools we have, and we are legislators, and we are financing civil society all over the union with taxpayers' money. So we will continue to do that.
Thank you very much. I know that JJ is going to come in and help us close, but maybe very, very quickly, because there's this one last question out there, is that for those of you, if you can help the audience to visualize what mainstream might, all the gender mainstream effects on the ground look like. One or two examples to kind of help us close this wonderful conversation. The question is asking, there has been a lot of backlash against gender mainstreaming from progressive feminists as well as right-wing parties. How do you see effects on the ground? I think we kind of addressed this, but one more chance.
Maybe if I can step in here, just one example is on a field which I'm much more familiarized with, violence against women and girls. And actually, Istanbul Convention as a tool was one of the best treaty which we could have at in this moment, because ratifying the treaty in all these different countries leads to very concrete measures on the ground. For example, like just taking Romania, one of the provision was regarding emergency protection orders. So we have in like more than 8,000 emergency protection orders in a year, when before it was none. So that is like seeing on the ground how a treaty who is giving a very good provision regarding an issue which is very clear, focused on women and girls, can lead on the ground. So mainstreaming the issues of the definition of violence against women this way help tremendously on the community level in terms of intervention, prevention, protection, and even if it's not maybe defined as a gender equality, allocating resources to this issue is very clearly gender budgeting from the perspective of putting money for solving this is gender mainstreaming this. So allocation of the money for solving different issues affecting differently, maybe even focusing on much more training for women to campaign and participate in the political life will be another way for mainstreaming, transforming society, bringing more women to the table on the political life. But this will be seen only allocating resources on that particular theme. So
thank you, Lara, and thank you to JJ for giving us this opportunity. This will certainly be the most memorable International Women's Day I have celebrated in a very, very long time. And thank you to our panelists for this wonderful journey. JJ?
Great. Thank you so much, Muge. Just to echo, Muge, this was a wonderful conversation, and thank you so much to our panelists for your insights. I always am very happy at the end of our roundtables when we could continue for another hour of discussion, because this is such a far-reaching and important topic. So I'm glad we are again at this point where we could continue. Unfortunately, we cannot, but that's always a nice way to end. So thank you all again. Thank you, Muge, for moderating, and to all of our panelists. Thank you to my colleagues at the European Studies Center and the Russia, East European and Eurasian Center for your help in organizing and promoting this wonderful event. And thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us from across the US and Europe as well. And I hope everyone has a wonderful, good rest of today, whether it's this evening or this afternoon. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
bye.
Nice meeting everybody.